Porra, os cria, porra!
Essa é, filha da puta!
Bom, já tem um plano de distração pra ele?
Não.
Vamos criar um plano de distração agora. Vamos manter a calma.
Blindado?
O blindado não sobe aqui.
A gente vai ter que descer.
A gente vai ter que descer com ele.
Ele tem, isso é ponte do Banjé. Não,
Subiu não! Caralho! Gente!
Caralho, aí, cadê o blindado, mano? Cadê o blindado?
Ali, capuz que eu falei, não faz.
Ai! Pega, menor! Pega, menor! Amassa!
Nem chegou na padaria.
Meu mano Tom, faixa preta, relíquia, filhão! Porradeiro intenso, filhão! A cúpula do CV! 3 humanos, só deitado e rolando no chão, filhão. Vinha bala, o que vinha acontecer, vinha bala, filhão. Ontem no Júnior gravando, vai tomar no cu, porra.
Ah, ele que é do Japão, porra.
Sem bala, filhão, vai tomando toda a vida. Olha lá, blindado não sobe não, filhão. Isso daqui é o império do urso,
Tá
filhão.
de castigo.
Não sobe, filho, não sobe, tá de castigo lá embaixo, nem tem tiro. Ah, os cria, filhão, os cria, deitadão. Se passar do trilhaço. Porradeiro intenso, filho. É, pai.
On October 28, 2025, Rio De Janeiro's North Zone turned into a real urban battlefield. Before dawn, around 2,500 security agents, including members of the military police, civil police, and elite units such as BOPE, Special Police, Operations Battalion, and CORE, Special Resources Coordination, surrounded the Penha and Alemão complexes, 2 of the largest favelas in the city. This wasn't a routine operation. It was the largest and most lethal police action ever recorded in Brazil. The mission, named Operation Containment, had a clear and ambitious goal: to dismantle the Comando Vermelho, Red Command, in its strongholds by executing roughly 100 arrest warrants against its leaders and members. Within hours, Rio witnessed scenes of war unlike anything ever imagined in a major metropolis. Intense gunfire, streets blocked by burning barricades, and helicopters hovering non-stop overhead. Images of armored vehicles and bodies lying in the streets shocked the nation and quickly spread around the world, sparking calls for investigations into the authorities' use of force. From the very first moments, the criminals' resistance was fierce. Heavily armed narco-terrorists responded to the police's advance with bursts of rifle fire, setting up flaming barricades to slow down the elite troops. In an unprecedented show of urban warfare tactics, members of the Comando Vermelho used modified drones to drop explosives on police units, a shocking display of the gang's organization and audacity. Meanwhile, the faction's allies attempted to sow chaos across the city. Buses were hijacked and set ablaze, and key expressways, such as Avenida Brazil and the red and yellow lines, were blocked in a desperate attempt to distract the police and spread terror among civilians. That morning, large portions of Rio de Janeiro came to a standstill. Thousands of residents were left without public transportation, forced to walk home amid scenes of panic and confusion. Not even in action movies, or in Memories of Elite Squad, the classic film about BOPE, had anyone seen anything comparable to the real-life scenario that unfolded in Rio de Janeiro during Operation Containment. To grasp the magnitude of the operation, one must first understand the enemy. The Comando Vermelho, or Red Command, is the oldest and arguably the most powerful criminal faction in Brazil. It was born inside Rio De Janeiro'S prisons during the 1970s military dictatorship, when common criminals and communist political prisoners were housed together. From those years of coexistence, street criminals learned guerrilla tactics that had been taught in Cuba and the Soviet Union, strategies that would later reshape organized crime in Brazil. What began as a gang of bank robbers evolved into an international drug trafficking network, establishing connections with foreign cartels in the decades that followed. During the 1980s and 1990s, the Red Command expanded its cocaine-funded empire. Yet its true power did not come solely from guns and money. It came from social control. The faction filled the void left by the state in many of Rio's poorest communities, enforcing its own brand of justice and offering protection through fear and forced loyalty. Across dozens of Rio's favelas, the Red Command dictates rules, mediates disputes, and maintains an alternative system of governance. Today, the organization operates as a nationwide narco-terrorist network, estimated to include tens of thousands of members, soldiers, traffickers, lookouts, enforcers, and financiers, spread across multiple Brazilian states. Recent studies showed that by 2023, the Red Command had expanded its territorial dominance across Rio's metropolitan region, controlling roughly 52% of all criminal areas, surpassing even the militias. Its influence now stretches far beyond Rio, reaching prisons, drug routes in the Amazon, and operational bases in distant states such as Amazonas, Pará, and Ceará. Locked in a constant war against rival factions like Terceiro Comando Puro, Pure Third Command, the Red Command has militarized itself into an urban army, complete with a rigid hierarchy, brutal discipline, and access to high-caliber weaponry. Drones, restricted-use rifles, explosives, and heavy ammunition. Nothing is missing from its arsenal. Over time, the faction turned certain favela complexes into true fortresses. It is no coincidence that the Alemão and Penha complexes became two of the Red Command's main bastions. These sprawling clusters of favelas, located in strategic areas near Rio's main expressways, Avenida Brasil and the Red Line, serve as logistical corridors for organized crime. Whoever controls Alemão and Penha controls the flow of weapons, drugs, and money in and out of the city, a sort of circulatory system for Rio's criminal trade. In these cities within the city, with labyrinthine alleys and steep hills crisscrossed by narrow trails, the leaders of the Red Command lived relatively safe, coordinating operations from the shadows. Many fugitives from other Brazilian states sought refuge there under the faction's protection. Evidence of this came during Operation Containment, when several of those captured or killed were wanted criminals from states such as Pará, Ceará, Bahia, Pernambuco, and Espírito Santo. Taking down the Red Command's leadership inside these strongholds meant delivering a historic blow to the organization. And that's exactly what Rio De Janeiro's security forces set out to do that morning. Strike at the logistical and financial brain of the Red Command, dismantle its command structure, and shatter its illusion of territorial control. What made Operation Containment both tactically successful and brutally violent was an unprecedented double encirclement strategy, nicknamed the BOPE Wall. In previous operations in the area, history had repeated itself. As soon as traffickers spotted the police advancing through the main access points, they fled through the dense forest of the Serra da Misericórdia, the mountain that connects the Penha and Alemão complexes. In 2010, 2018, and 2022. Iconic scenes showed dozens of criminals running along train tracks and through the woods to escape, often carrying heavy weapons in full view of TV helicopters. This time, however, the police were ready. Days before the main assault, BOPE teams secretly infiltrated the mountain, taking up hidden vantage points along the ridge. So when regular military police battalions and civil police agents began their pre-dawn incursions into Penha's alleys on October 28th, BOPE was already positioned above, silently waiting to spring the trap. Around 6 in the morning, as firefights intensified in the lower streets and the police armored vehicles broke through the first lines of defense, the Red Command leaders gave the order everyone expected: retreat through the mountain. Hundreds of heavily armed narco-terrorists began climbing toward the ridge, confident they would repeat the escapes of previous years. But this time they ran straight into the Wall of Skulls, a containment line of BOPE operators positioned at the summit. What followed was the fiercest battle of the entire operation. A close-quarters clash fought in dense forest, on steep terrain, with near-zero visibility. The officers, trained in jungle and guerrilla warfare, faced groups of narco-terrorists dressed in camouflage and using insurgent tactics in a desperate attempt to break through. Gunfire echoed across the mountains for hours. Residents later reported hearing sporadic bursts well into the afternoon. Trapped with no way out, many of the terrorists fell along the slopes of Serra da Misericordia, a natural funnel that became the death corridor for the faction. Only a few escaped alive. Meanwhile, in the lower parts of the favela, other police units secured ground. The Shock Battalion and RECOM, Special Rounds and Crowd Control Unit of the Rio De Janeiro State Military Police, advanced through main streets, supporting BOPE and cutting off secondary routes. The CORE, Special Operations Coordination of the Civil Police, targeted high-value suspects, while regular battalions, such as the 41st and 3rd, established perimeter containment. Maps released later showed how state forces divided sectors and sealed off every side, a rare achievement in favela operations where terrain and leaks often compromise missions. This time, the element of surprise was decisive. BOPE cut off the head of the serpent, ambushing the leaders and their bodyguards precisely along the one route they thought was safe. From the criminal side, the response was unlike anything seen before. A full-scale asymmetric war. Instead of scattering, many narco-terrorists chose to stand and fight, holding defensive positions to delay the police advance. Some officers fell victim to ambushes in narrow alleys. 2 civil police agents were killed in what appeared to be traps set by retreating gunmen. The Red Command escalated the conflict to its highest level, deploying bomb-carrying drones, setting fire barricades, and attacking civilian infrastructure, including blocking roads near the international airport and firing at the Yellow Line Expressway from distant hills to spread mass panic. The terrorists also shot at civilians to blame police forces, attempting to manipulate public opinion and international media. They were aided by collaborators disguised as residents, men and women who claimed to be innocent locals. These sympathizers climbed to the battle zone, retrieved the bodies of fallen terrorists, and staged an elaborate deception. They stripped the dead of their camouflage and tactical gear, leaving them in underwear, then placed grieving mothers to cry over them, all to portray the operation as a massacre of innocent youths. Police later confirmed this as a coordinated disinformation tactic now under investigation. In truth, 123 terrorists surrendered and were arrested, while those who chose to fight were neutralized. Contrary to popular belief, the first recorded use of combat drones did not occur in the Azerbaijan-Armenia War. According to former BOPE captain and elite squad creator Rodrigo Pimentel, the first use of drones in combat was in 2017 in Rio de Janeiro, when the narco-terrorist known as Penha deployed 12 drones during the takeover of Cidade Alta, a favela complex in the city's north zone. Pimentel is emphatic that Rio's public security crisis goes far beyond ordinary crime, defining it as a non-international armed conflict. Observers compared the 2025 scenes to the Culiacanazo, the 2019 incident in Mexico when the Sinaloa cartel besieged Culiacan using similar urban terror tactics to force the government's hand. The difference, however, was that Rio's police never backed down. Burning armored vehicles, bullets whizzing in every direction, and helicopters roaring overhead formed the backdrop of that day, a surreal image of total war in the heart of a metropolis that still calls itself a peaceful democratic state. After nearly 24 hours of non-stop combat, the final numbers from Operation Containment are both staggering and haunting. Officially, 121 people were killed during the mission, making it the deadliest police operation ever recorded in Brazil. According to authorities, 117 of the dead were suspects linked to the Comando Vermelho, Red Command, including several high-profile and highly dangerous criminals. The remaining 4 were fallen heroes, officers who gave their lives in the line of duty. Civil police, Corps agents Marcos Vinicius Cardoso de Carvalho and Rodrigo Velloso Cabral, and military police BOPE sergeants Clayton Serafim Gonçalves and Heber Carvalho da Fonseca. At least 13 police officers were wounded, 9 from the military police and 4 from the civil police, some in serious condition, underscoring the level of armed resistance the narco-terrorists put up. In total, 113 adult suspects were arrested and 10 teenagers detained, bringing the total number of prisoners to 123. The blow to organized crime was massive. Authorities seized 118 firearms, including 91 assault rifles, some restricted for military use, along with dozens of pistols, revolvers, and 14 explosive devices. Tons of drugs, stolen vehicles, and other illegal materials were also confiscated. The rifles alone represented an estimated financial loss of nearly 5 million reais to the faction. Some of the weapons bore inscriptions from other states, such as Comando Vermelho do Amazonas and Tropa de Manaus, and even foreign weapons allegedly diverted from the armed forces of neighboring countries like Venezuela, revealing the extensive supply network behind the Red Command. Among the most notable targets neutralized were several high-ranking members of the faction. Luan Tubarão Marcolino, a Red Command boss from Ceará, was killed in the fighting. Others, like Rodrigo de Jesus Coelho, known as RD, believed to be the group's leader in Tucuruí, Pará, and Joelison Fuzue Barbosa, were captured alive, both previously wanted in their home states. However, not everything went as planned. The main target of the operation, Edgar Alves de Andrade, known as Doca or the Bear, believed to be one of the Red Command's top generals in Rio, managed to escape during the chaos. Reports indicate that he broke through the siege with the help of dozens of armed bodyguards and remains at large. The Rio de Janeiro government has since offered a 100,000 reais reward for information leading to his capture. Despite this high-profile escape, authorities hailed the operation as a resounding success in weakening the faction. "We neutralized 206 members of the Red Command in less than 24 hours, between the dead and the captured," celebrated a police spokesperson, emphasizing that several of those neutralized were regional leaders. In short, the Red Command suffered the most devastating blow in its history, losing weapons, territory, and manpower on an unprecedented scale. Yet, controversy quickly emerged over the human cost of this victory. Activist groups, NGOs, and so-called human rights organizations questioned whether all the deaths were justified and whether the police used excessive force. What these critics refuse to admit is that Rio de Janeiro's situation long ago ceased to be a mere public security issue. It has become a civil war, waged by irregular forces against the legitimate security forces of the state. Police footage released after the operation showed third parties removing weapons, vests, and camouflage gear from bodies in the forest before dragging them into the streets, likely an attempt to portray the dead as unarmed civilians. This act constitutes evidence tampering and is now under investigation. The official death toll recognized by the state remains 121, with the Secretary of Security stating that the only true victims were the 4 fallen officers. However, the Public Defender's Office reported 132 total deaths, including initially unidentified suspects and possibly some civilians caught in the crossfire. The legacy of Operation Containment is clear. It marked the bloodiest day in Brazil's law enforcement history, a day that blurred the line between policing and war, and showed that in Rio de Janeiro the battle for control of the city is far from over. Operation Containment immediately divided opinions across Brazil and far beyond its borders. Amid the shock and chaos, Rio de Janeiro's governor, Cláudio Castro, was quick to defend the mission. On Wednesday, October 29th, less than a day after the clashes, he publicly declared the operation a success, congratulating security forces for delivering a decisive blow to the Comando Vermelho. Aligned with Brazil's political right, Governor Castro labeled the dead criminals as narco-terrorists, arguing that Rio de Janeiro was not dealing with common crime, but with terrorism linked to drug trafficking. In his words, there were no innocent victims. The state's goal was to annihilate the parallel power structure the Red Command held over the communities, and that goal, he said, had been achieved. A significant portion of the local population seemed to agree. A Datafolha survey conducted shortly after the operation found that 57% of Rio residents considered the mega operation successful. Most respondents also said they believed that all or most of the dead were armed criminals, not innocent victims. Internationally, the event drew massive attention. The United Nations and global media outlets highlighted the fact that over 100 people had been killed in a single police operation, a rarity even in the most violent nations. Comparisons soon emerged with anti-cartel operations in Mexico and Colombia, and the term narco-terrorism began circulating to describe Rio de Janeiro's escalating crisis. Operation Containment will be remembered as a turning point in Rio's long war against organized crime and terrorism, and as a striking example of Brazil's deep public security dilemmas. On one hand, it proved that the state, when equipped with coordination and strategic planning, can deliver a decisive blow to a powerful faction, removing dangerous criminals from circulation and reclaiming territories once dominated by traffickers, even if only temporarily. For many citizens, exhausted by decades of violence, the operation felt like justice finally served. A cathartic moment when the state struck back against fear itself. Yet the mission also exposed political and institutional fractures. Without direct federal support, since the operation was carried out solely by Rio de Janeiro's state forces, divisions over how to fight criminal factions became evident. And a looming question remained. What comes next? Unlike conventional wars, organized crime never truly ends. Without a sustained plan for permanent territorial occupation and social reinvestment in these communities, the void left behind may soon be filled by other criminal leaders, whether remnants of the Red Command or emerging rival factions, reigniting the cycle of violence. Indeed, after police withdrawal, many residents reported fear of retaliation, staying locked inside their homes in tense silence. For now, October 28, 2025, has already entered the history books as the day Rio de Janeiro stood still during an unprecedented urban war. The scenes of armored vehicles crashing through flaming barricades, officers exchanging gunfire in dense forest, and 121 bodies counted by nightfall will linger for years. Each number, each image, carrying its own meaning depending on who remembers it. For some, it was the victory of law and order over narco-terrorism, a necessary if brutal cleansing of heavily armed militants. For others, it was a tragedy, a grim reminder of the price Brazil pays for decades of social neglect and institutional failure. In the balance between success and catastrophe, Operation Containment forces Brazil to once again confront its most difficult truth. that public security, social justice, and human rights remain entangled in a fragile, uneasy coexistence. The hope now is that ongoing investigations will expose any abuses committed and that the authorities will learn from this episode, ensuring that Rio de Janeiro never again has to endure a day of war like that one. One thing, however, is certain. After that day, no Carioca will ever forget the deafening sound of gunfire that morning, nor the difficult questions that have echoed ever since. The Rio de Janeiro mega operation came at a steep human cost, yet it sparked an enormous public reaction, especially among Brazilians who favor a hard-line stance on crime. Governor Claudio Castro, once seen as a local political figure, emerged from the episode as a national symbol of resistance against organized crime, gaining prominence among conservative and right-wing groups. Within just 3 days after the operation, Castro's popularity exploded online. He gained over 800,000 new followers across his official social media accounts. On Instagram alone, his audience jumped from 464,000 followers on the eve of the raid to 1.3 million by October 31st. This spontaneous surge showed that many Brazilians viewed Castro as a law and order hero, applauding his willingness to confront the entrenched power of narco-terrorism in the favelas, a menace many believed the federal government had failed to control. Castro called the operation a success, emphasizing that its goal was to contain the faction's advance and capture its leaders, which for the most part was achieved. Supporters praised him for refusing to mourn the dead criminals and for commending the officers who carried out their mission, setting himself apart from the progressive discourse that often criticizes police operations. While left-leaning activists denounced the action as a massacre, public sentiment online leaned overwhelmingly toward relief and approval. Many argued that Rio and Brazil as a whole needed a firmer hand against violent gangs, and that leaders like Castro were among the few willing to take that stand. One of the most notable endorsements came from Martin DeLuca, an attorney close to former U.S. President Donald Trump. Following the operation, DeLuca accused Brazil's top courts, the Supreme Federal Court, STF, and the Superior Electoral Court, TSE, of acting in ways that benefit organized crime instead of fully supporting law enforcement. He directly criticized STF Justices Gilmar Mendes and Flavio Dino, who publicly condemned the police action only a day after it ended, citing concerns over excessive force. According to DeLuca, their concern should not have been with the police who risked their lives, but with the gangs armed with Venezuelan military rifles, drones, and grenades. He warned, "When judges care more about restraining the authorities than stopping criminals, something fundamental has broken." DeLuca went further, suggesting that Governor Castro was facing political persecution. He pointed out that just 1 day after leading Brazil's largest operation against the Red Command, a group the U.S. government is reportedly considering designating a foreign terrorist organization, the TSE abruptly scheduled a trial that could revoke Castro's mandate over alleged electoral irregularities. To DeLuca and many of Castro's supporters, the timing was suspicious. Governor Castro is one of the few leaders willing to confront organized crime, DeLuca wrote. Brazil cannot defeat crime if its institutions punish courage and reward paralysis. These statements from Trump's inner circles strengthened the perception among conservatives that President Lula's administration and its judicial allies were more focused on silencing opponents like Castro than dismantling criminal networks. The transnational dimension of the fight became evident not only through the weapons seized, but also through intelligence cooperation between Rio de Janeiro and São Paulo Janeiro and the United States. Roughly 8 months before the operation, the Rio state government delivered a classified report to the Trump administration detailing the Red Command's activities inside U.S. territory. Prepared by Rio's Public Security Intelligence Division, The report contained evidence that the faction had expanded its operations into North America, including logistical and financial activity on U.S. soil. The document was handed over at the U.S. consulate in Rio de Janeiro, with the goal of strengthening bilateral cooperation against the cartel. Officials warned that if decisive action isn't taken, the United States could soon face the same asymmetric warfare that Brazil has endured for decades, a conflict waged by narco-terrorist groups within a democratic society. By bypassing President Lula's federal administration and appealing directly to Washington, the Rio government signaled that it views Brazil's organized crime problem as a regional security threat that also concerns the United States. The timing of the report coincided with moves by the Trump administration to consider designating the Comando Vermelho and other South American cartels as international terrorist organizations. Such a designation, unprecedented for Brazilian criminal groups, would allow the U.S. to apply counter-terrorism sanctions, seize assets, extradite leaders, and coordinate arrests abroad. Within Brazil, the mega operation reignited fierce debates in Congress. Right-wing lawmakers seized the moment to push forward a bill classifying criminal factions such as the Red Command, CV, and the First Capital Command, PCC, as terrorist organizations. The House of Representatives scheduled the vote for November 11th under an emergency procedure. The bill aims to expand Brazil's anti-terrorism law to include heavily armed criminal groups that threaten public safety, effectively treating them as terrorists. Supporters, including Bolsonaro-aligned politicians and his sons Carlos and Eduardo Bolsonaro, argue that groups like the Red Command engage in terror tactics, murder, intimidation, and attacks on authorities, and therefore must be dealt with as terrorists. As São Paulo's Public Security Secretary Guilherme Derrite stated, drug traffickers are not victims. The initiative faces strong opposition from President Lula's government and its left-wing allies, who claim that these groups lack political or ideological motives and thus don't fit the legal definition of terrorism. Yet critics counter that many of these factions do pursue ideological influence, using sympathetic artists, influencers, and activist media outlets to manipulate public perception and defend criminal interests. The Justice Ministry fears that passing the law could open the door to federal military interventions or foreign cooperation on Brazilian soil, moves that conflict with the administration's agenda. Still, growing public pressure and tacit U.S. support could be enough to ensure the bill's approval. If passed, it would mark a historic defeat for President Lula's left-wing coalition and a major victory for Brazil's law and order bloc, enabling harsher sentences, asset seizures, and even the deployment of the armed forces against criminal factions when necessary. The warning from Rio's governor resonates beyond Brazil's borders. The people of the United States must open their eyes. These narco-terrorist groups are already operating on American soil, and we cannot allow in the U.S. what has already happened in Brazil.